Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the latest in our webcast series. We're talking about procure to pay, and one of the journeys, the role of P-cards, purchasing cards, V-cards, and the kind of subtext here about there may be things we can do to dramatically improve our P2P performance, which don't necessarily require a digital transformation for some journeys. So let's see what we can learn here. My name's Dan French. I'm founder and CEO of Consider Solutions, and many of you I have met before, so welcome. I'm very, very pleased to welcome also Lynn Larson, who's principal of Recharged Education. And Lynn's been, she's had a long career in purchasing and finance, and she's implemented P-card programs, and latterly she's operated as an educator and advisor. So we're very privileged to have Lynn join us. Welcome, Lynn.
Well, great. Thanks, Dan. I'm happy to be here.
Great, and so we're going to be hearing from Lynn. Here's our agenda. It's a 30-minute session as we promised, so we're going to be pretty punchy here. I'm giving some broad introductions. I want to talk a little bit about purchase to pay, procure to pay, source to pay, however you describe your end-to-end cycle, and the process and the various journeys and what it is we're all trying to achieve here, because it's a complex interplay of different dynamics. Lynn's going to talk us through the myths, benefits, controls, and practicalities around cards. What can we learn? And I'm going to close that out, and then we'll answer some questions. So please ask questions as we go through. We'll endeavour to answer them at the end. If we don't have time to answer all of them, we'll respond by email. So thank you for that. So please, please ask questions as we go. So first, I'm going to have two little polls for you to make sure you're awake and had your coffee. One is very simple. It's how do you describe your role? So, and this is really to help you understand what company you're in this session. So are you one, in sourcing or procurement, two, primarily in finance or accounting, three, shared services or GBS, four, ITIS, and five, other. Just select one of those, the one that most closely reflects your world. So that should be very straightforward. If you don't know whether you're 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, I guess you're 5. So I know for some of you it's early in the morning, and for some of you it's getting on a bit, but let's have a look. So what have we got? Who do we have amongst us? So the majority of you, the biggest percentage of you are from shared services, GBS, followed by finance and sourcing and procurement. Okay, so that's good to know. So thank you. And one other question for you, which is, with respect to card usage, commercial cards, what is your organization's current usage? Now, here's one where you select all options that apply. So one is you've got T&E cards for company spend in use. Two is you've got P cards in use for some tail spend. Three, you've got V cards in use for some spend categories or supplier types. Four, no widespread use of cards yet, but you're discussing it. And five, they're just not an option for you. So just select all that apply. I guess it would be difficult to have all five. That would be an unusual, an unusual trick to be able to have all of those. But I'm sure many of you have got a couple of those. So please have a think about it. Let's see what your response is. Let's have a look at this. So pretty much over half of you have company T&E cards, P cards for some tail spend. Okay, that's kind of interesting. So thank you for that. So you know where you stand and you know what company you're in. So thank you very much there. That's great. So we're talking about this scope of source and purchase to pay, and we have this classic, almost cartoon-like picture here. This is the classic picture in the corporate world we tend to see, but of course it doesn't have to always be that way. And whenever we talk to organizations, and when you talk within your organization, what are the drivers for change? What does transformation need to deliver for our organization? These are pretty much always the 6 key objectives. Now, most organizations don't have all 6 at the same time. Most people tend to prioritize 1 or 2 at any point in their maturity. But it's quite interesting here. Obviously the big one, reducing effort and cost of the process, reducing cycle time of the process. Obviously, from a procurement point of view, source to pay transformation should help improve the very rationale of sourcing and procurement, which is reduced cost of goods and services. But optimizing working capital, managing risk, and reducing maverick spend are all big issues. So that's kind of interesting. And of course, the end-to-end process is a set of complex dynamics, and many of you, if not all of you, are kind of trying to manage this in your organization in a global in a global context. And of course, in the classic kind of accounts payable form of settlement in source or purchase to pay, that's where we spend a lot of the time. And 95% of the issues you have in that, 95% of the cost, in fact, of accounts payable is caused by issues on the left-hand side. So anything we can do that helps sort of drive some kind of rationalization there has got to be considered. So, but we also tend to assume that with these end-to-end processes, there's one big answer. So when you look at purchase to pay or any other big cycles, a lot of people would encourage you to think if you apply one route, it'll solve all your problems. And the truth is, we know it's not true. So for purchase to pay, you've got direct spend journeys, you've got PO-based journeys, you've got non-PO-based capital, T&E, intercompany, all sorts. And most companies have, 8, 9, or 10, even in a really well organized world. So what we're looking at is, what do those journeys apply to? What's the best blend of the internal experience, the supplier experience, the efficiency, the cost, all of those things? What's the best blend that we can segment our spend in that way? So that puts a little bit of context around what we mean by the Pcard and VCard journey within the P2P mix. But if you look at this kind of interesting analysis here from some great analytics from the shared services and outsourcing network, they produce some great stuff. Here's some across a large set of GBS and shared services organizations. What's the split of invoice channels? Because of course invoice processing is a big part of the cost today. Now you'll see, you don't have to be Einstein to realize there that paper, PDF, and electronic, the kind of electronic but not digital, if you see what I mean. The second one is kind of the biggest, most popular, still the most popular invoice channel, and that's where all the cost is. And obviously keyed manually is getting less, thankfully, as a result of COVID, but still, those are some interesting numbers there. But the relative cost of these journeys is interesting. So if we say the most popular journey is actually the scan, capture, workflow PDF version, that's minimum 4 times more expensive than a self-bill or a self-service Pcard approach. So that's kind of interesting. And Hackett Group, will tell you that just the cost of processing an invoice is somewhere between $4 and $25, just a single invoice, and up to 50. And that raises some interesting questions. So we're looking for ways of having control over spend without having all of that overhead cost as well. So that's kind of interesting stuff. And of course, it's not just the cost of processing invoices, it's the cost of dealing with supplier queries. And that's a big part of the cost. So we've got to bear that in mind as well. So another interesting bit of stat there from SSON. So, these are all the things that challenge you when you're trying to look at your purchase to pay cycle. And these are the kind of things you're trying to eliminate or certainly make easier when thinking about Pcards and VCards. Now, the other part of the equation is the whole thing about tail spend. So this Vilfredo Pareto is a hero of mine. The 80-20 rule, can we produce, can we get 80% of the value from 20% of the effort? Or in this case, can we eliminate 80% of unnecessary work for 20%? So here you see this classic curve. On the right-hand side of tail spend, you see the number of vendors and number of invoices go up exponentially, but the actual value, the spend, go down. This is the last, this is the last 20% of the spend. So this is a well-known characteristic, but the lowest value, 20%, is the highest invoice volume and usually the most painful to process and most costly. And you're talking about a cost of processing invoices, which is higher than the value of the invoice itself, which is somewhat painful. Now, of course, everyone would have you believe the answer is to automate. And again, here's another bit of SSON research that 50% of people say they're partially automated, which I guess is kind of self-evident. But a thing to remember is this lovely quote on the right is, technology is great, but technology that applies to an efficient operation will magnify the efficiency. But technology that applies to an inefficient operation will magnify the inefficiency. So the key thing for us to do is work out where's the smart money, where do we put our time, how do we segment and stratify our processes so we've got efficiencies we can magnify. So this is this idea of the P2P mix. We've got to understand, what does good look like? Why are we doing this? And that's that's a question answered in those 6 transformation objectives. We've got to look at people, process, technology, and data. Got to understand the end-to-end cycle and understand those journeys, which we've touched on already. So getting to the core of this, is there a better way? Is there a complementary journey, a way through this, which can take some of the effort away, the frustration away, and save us some money? So with that, a pretty good segue for Lynn. So Lynn, I'd like to ask you now to share us some of your experience and observations and lessons learned with Pcards. Lynn.
Well, absolutely, Dan. Thank you. And you might notice right off the bat that I am saying that purchasing cards, or Pcards as they're known, is a solution for low value spend. So I'm not saying it's the only solution, but it is a good solution when it is effectively implemented and managed. So just real quickly about my background. I know Dan already was pretty good there at introducing me at the beginning, but I have been in this space for, I say, more than 20 years. I've stopped counting, but that includes managing a P-card and T&E card program. Back in the day, I had worked for a professional association in an education role, and then I launched my business, Recharged Education, back in 2014, where I work with providers and companies, organizations of all sizes. So with that, Dan, go ahead and we'll look at that 80-20 rule some more that you just alluded to. I know from dealing with all sorts of organizations that the majority of their invoice volume or their purchases are for a low value dollar amount, dollars if you're in the US and otherwise low value for the rest of the world. But you can put a dollar amount on that however you like, whether it is $2,500 or $5,000, but they do end up comprising roughly 60 to 80% of what organizations are dealing with. And Dan just said that in some cases, the whole process of getting those taken care of cost more in labor than the actual value of the invoice itself. So at this point, one solution, as I mentioned, would be purchasing cards. And you can see here, it's just one of many different types of commercial card solutions that are out there. Many of you are also, as the earlier poll showed, you're using corporate travel cards, and you might be even using virtual cards, which is a flavor of electronic payables or electronic accounts payable. And we know that many of you are advanced with card programs. In fact, Dan, on your second poll, you should have had an option saying, we're great with purchasing cards today.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are some organizations that can say that, but the whole point here, it is to create that streamlined process. And we know, from just dealing with different clients that many organizations still struggle with that, as Dan, you're saying, low tail, I call it low value spend. And so you can use Pcards as a way to try to get some of that away from the accounts payable function. And instead, well, let's move to the next slide. We'll look at the processes. You can see there in the middle that when you take a traditional purchase to pay process, oftentimes, but not always, it requires requisitions and pre-purchase approvals along with purchase orders, POs, procurement gets involved. I often say that procurement is rubber stamping things because it's something will show up on their desk and they have to create a purchase order, and it might be very minimal in terms of the dollar amount, but yet they're having to create a PO, that you've got the whole invoice process, you've got that payment by accounts payable, AP. So there are all those steps. And we know that, this slide really is simplistic because, certainly you can have different versions of it. But if you think about what Pcards are intended to do, it's to just eliminate all the steps that don't necessarily add value for that low tail spend. And, I realize too that many organizations now have AP automation that has been so valuable. And that often comes with embedded virtual cards or VCs. I know, Dan, you had that on a slide. And that fits somewhere in the realm of that traditional P2P process. But is it always worth it to bring everything in through your AP automation system? Maybe, maybe not. Again, we're looking at Pcards as a solution for organizations that are really struggling with all these low value things that tend to clog up the pipeline. And it results in both procurement and accounts payable doing activities that maybe don't add a whole lot of value. So if you move on to looking at, just that summary of how P-cards work, you know what I'm talking about here. It's card holders are placing orders directly with suppliers. Card holders, again, being all throughout the organization. The supplier is fulfilling the order, charging the card holder looks at those transactions to make sure they're right. And then it's only once a month at a minimum where accounts payable, AP, is getting that big entire bill from the card provider, looking at the total, paying the bill. Again, simplistic, but you can see here how it takes so much of the work away from the accounts payable team. So when the benefits come around, looking at the scope of where P-cards truly can add value, it's what I just mentioned. It's streamlining the whole P2P process. Now, even thinking back to that earlier slide where I showed you can get rid of the requisition, you can get rid of purchase orders, I realized too, some organizations say, you know what, we're just going to keep everything exactly the same. We're going to stick with that traditional route, yet we're going to tack on a P-card payment at the end, likely giving someone in accounts payable a P-card, and then they're contacting the supplier to pay for an invoice. I realize that happens. It's not a process that I would recommend because you're really losing the efficiencies of what I've been already alluding to. But it's certainly one version. And so that's what I mean where, you get into all sorts of iterations. Every organization is unique and every single payment method as well as process has pros and cons. So I'm never, one to promote one single solution. But P-cards will streamline the process if you design it appropriately. And that can mean organizations, in particular, each individual department gets things more quickly. So I have that shorter procurement cycle. It's convenient, for employees throughout an organization. We've talked already about it taking a lot of that invoice volume out of accounts payable. It could be anywhere from 60 to 80%. 80% was back to that 80-20 rule. But some organizations have said, well, in our case, it's like 55 or it's 60, 75. It's still the majority of what you are doing. And from there, you can pick up that potential float. It's just like as consumers, we use our credit cards, so we don't have to pay today. We can wait till that bill comes around. You have the ability to potentially pick up what's known as revenue share or rebate. And then when you're talking about in the US, you get some relief for the federal 1099 reporting. So there's this whole slew of benefits that can come with cards. But Dan, as we know, we hear from a lot of organizations that say, well, I know what's going to happen. We're going to give employees a P-card and they're going to steal from us. And I know that's a big hangup. Many controllers, executives, anyone, you name it, they think that that is what is going to happen. Well, I can say it certainly is a risk. I'm not going to lie and say it never happens. But where I see it happening, it's within the organizations that do not have the appropriate controls. I would argue that it's easier for an employee to steal if they can use their personal cards for business expenses and then get reimbursed. Because when you allow them to use their personal cards, there really isn't any visibility into what they are truly using their cards for. So this is where if you have controls and you can see the list there, you have to be really designing that control environment thoughtfully in order to help prevent or detect any sort of fraud. Now, I want to pay particular attention to a couple of these bullet points here. And again, by no means is it an all-encompassing list, but these are the major categories of controls. It's that consistent enforcement. So many organizations think, oh, I'm just going to implement P-cards because they're supposed to be so great. We're supposed to be able to get value and possibly revenue share or rebate maybe. And there's all these things, but they just hand out the cards, so to speak, without doing any sort of training. They're not really defining what is expected of card holders and their managers for that matter. They don't have anyone who is designated for managing the program. It's just all very loose or lax in terms of controls. Auditing is another one. I have dealt with organizations that only do some independent auditing of their card transactions once a year. And that is something where absolutely recommend it be done monthly or more. There's technology solutions out there that allow you to do auditing on an ongoing basis. So if you have all these control elements in place, you greatly reduce the likelihood that your employees will misuse the card product. In fact, I have seen it time and again that in some cases it helps organizations identify employees who actually have been stealing in other ways for years, and it wasn't until they were given a P card and their activities were more visible did the organization realize what was going on. So there's some good news here that there are ways of controlling your program, but I know there are also still some challenges. And, especially when I think about the European landscape there, I mean, regulatory controls or regulatory requirements rather have really been changing, especially in the last, I don't know, year or two. In the US and, well, you have tax challenges both in the US and then the VAT, elsewhere. You might have differences in accounting practices. Some things that are common both to the US and the broader market, including Europe, is you have all these departments in an organization that tend to work in silos, and so you don't have the cross collaboration. So Dan, I'm glad you had that initial poll in there because, about someone's role, because no matter what your role, you need to think about the bigger picture of who is all involved or tied to that purchase to pay process, and who therefore needs to come together to design a process that's effective for everyone and addresses all the different challenges. So you've got the silo challenge to overcome. And then going just back even to the international landscape for a moment, I know that especially like in Europe, I'll use that as an example, many issuers don't offer a true P card product. That is, they might be issuing cards to organizations based on a consumer model, which does not have some of those same inherent controls, namely things related to spend limits and controlling the types of merchants that cards can be used with. So there are those issues. Europe is really challenging in some ways because I know that P card adoption has been a lot slower than it has been in the US. And, it's for a variety of reasons. But, again, that's kind of why both Dan and I thought it was good to get back to the basics with this quick 30-minute overview today to just get all of your organizations thinking about where are our pain points, how can we maybe insert a purchasing card, a P card, into the mix of solutions to really better address, just how much volume and, kind of tedious activities that procurement, sourcing, accounts payable, even finance are contending with. And so I'm not trying to gloss over all the challenges. Yeah, there definitely are some, but that's where I think if you really are conscientious about the implementation, and there are some key steps related to that. If you're conscientious about looking at your internal opportunity, I'll use one example of I've dealt with a nonprofit organization. In their case, they had a lot of volunteers that were making purchases for the organization, and then they would go through a reimbursement process. Well, that was really a pain point. And so that organization looked at different commercial card solutions that would help alleviate that. So that's just one example, but it's looking, I would say, take a dollar amount, take a threshold, and start to investigate just how much of your invoice volume falls below that dollar threshold. And you might go, wow, 60% of what we are doing is actually like under $500, or I can't do the euro conversion, sorry, Dan, but you can just pick a dollar amount and look at what's happening below that threshold. And then it's all about preparing a business case. I mean, where can you save? What can happen if suddenly the invoice volume drops for your accounts payable area by, say, 20%, 30, whatever it is? What could those folks be doing today to add more value into the process? I mentioned bringing the stakeholders together, getting rid of those silos that so often hold back an organization from implementing a true effective program. You can walk through all of these steps, but I think the number one thing organizations use, I already alluded to it, is they throw cards into the hands of employees, and they don't think about all these other steps first, or they choose an issuer before thinking about all these steps. But, Dan, I would say, anyone on the call today, if you want a more robust resource related to P-card implementation, go ahead and email me. My contact information is out there, and I can send you something that summarizes what I'm talking about today and offers additional insight into the steps. But it's really about what Dan alluded to sum that up, about taking all of your activity, all your P2P processes, and you start to segment and decide what is most efficient, where can we gain the most value, and help correct some of the problems we're experiencing. So Dan, do you want to take it back, see if there are questions? I mean, this was our 15-minute pitch for something that we could talk about for days.
Thank you, Lynn. I do encourage you to contact Lynn for her implementation overview. There's a lot of depth in this, and as she indicated, there's a whole bunch of questions. And I'd like to just make a little point, and thank you so much for Lynn for your kind of broad, and you've touched on some key topics there. This question about fraud is an interesting one. I know some CFOs who've said, "Oh, we don't want to have P-cards because of the potential for fraud," and the P2P process owner said, "Do you have any idea what fraud we're exposed to with a PO invoice process?" And they had the conversation, and the CFO said, "Actually, that's a good point, because it's actually a lot more transparent with P-cards than it is with POs and all of the, who's ordering it, who's approving it, who's receiving it, where did it actually go."
Well, right, and there's there's protections, basically, think about the ability to dispute a transaction if it's fraudulent.
So yeah, so this is great stuff. So reach out to Lynn, get that guide. So I'm sure we've got a couple of questions coming through already. Do ask questions in the GoToWebinar interface. You've got a question panel there. Pop your questions in. Let's just think about what we learned from this. So we do know that we're all driven, particularly with the economic headwinds, we're driven towards greater efficiency, greater effectiveness, and a better employee experience for our whole purchasing and payment cycle. So we're all targeted with the same goals. We know that technology is powerful, but come back to the journeys. Technology is very powerful in some of the journeys. It's not so powerful in others, and it's got to support an effective process. So that's one thing I go on about a lot. Just make sure you've got a clear process for each segment, each journey of your P2P cycle. Segmenting spend makes a lot of sense. That helps you get down to the, what's the appropriate place for P-cards. It also helps you work out what's the appropriate place for other solutions, including technologies. So segmenting your spend makes a lot of sense. And it's all about horses for courses. For direct spend, you may well be using EDI. For some of the larger scale indirect, you might be using e-invoicing, but P-cards and V-cards certainly have a place to play. And Lynn kind of touched on this, and we often think about, when we're looking at ways of changing processes, we often look at the investment case, the return on investment. Well, you've got to look at the benefits, but some changes to processes, the investment case is quite low. The investment's low for a high benefit. So think about that. You're not talking about a lot of capital investment here. So that's worth thinking about. And I would certainly encourage you to consider, assess the feasibility for a certain segment of spend, think about a pilot program, and ask Lynn for advice, because she's been there herself implementing the program as well as advising. So that's some thoughts for you. And this is a quote I use a lot, and there's a lot more to this than it appears. Simplicity, obviously, as a user of anything, simplicity is a lovely thing, right? But it's very sophisticated, and to be simple is difficult. And this is where we kind of get confused. But if we can make a simple process for people in the right segments of spend, you're going to get a lot of value out of that, and your organization is going to be better off for it. So simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And coming back to our good friend Wilfredo Pareto, think about Pareto thinking. What can we do that we have all these strategic initiatives, these red line initiatives that take 2 or 3 years to start delivering value. What can we do that's much quicker to drive a speed of return where we can get 80% or more of the value for a particular segment of spend for 20% or less of the effort and investment? And that's, I think, what we're hearing from Lynn. So this is what we've been talking about. I want to pick up a couple of questions. We've got a very little bit amount of time before we get to the end. So our questions, let us see. So what do we got here? Right, so I'll jump straight into this. Okay, what's the best way to scope a pilot? Lynn, what's your view of that? How would you scope a pilot for Pcards? Or what things you need to consider, I guess, to scope a pilot?
Right. No, doing a pilot, I mean, you want to have a variety of purchasing, pathways, if you will. Like look at your departments, and some might go into a retail location, some might be doing online activity. So I would think about, bringing in a variety and starting with just a couple different departments and testing out those different ways in which employees make purchases. And once you are evaluating the trials, tribulations, if you will, the successes, you can make adjustments, then go out and add additional departments to test it out. You just don't want to throw them out throughout the whole company from the get-go, because it could be real messy. So start with a couple, but get a variety and work your way out from there.
Okay, thank you. And here's an interesting one. With companies looking to extend payment terms, as in make them further out, and you've got 60, 70, 80, 90-day payment terms, do you not lose that flexibility when moving to Pcards, because the provider will want to be paid in a classic 30-day time frame? Or is that not the case?
Well, and that really depends on your, your terms, conditions with the issuer, and that varies. I mean, there's not one exact answer for every organization and every issuer. I know especially, well, it's worldwide. It's not just Europe, but I mean, you're right, Dan. I mean, organizations now tend to be slow with their payments, the non-card way. And sometimes they're afraid of losing that. But, then you have to start thinking about the supplier side of things, which is a whole nother topic. Are your suppliers happy today? Could you get payment to them quickly through the usage of a card product, still pick up some float, whether that float is more than or less than what you're doing today through non-card channels? That's all up for debate. That's something that has to be negotiated.
Could also use that to negotiate better pricing terms, maybe, with suppliers. And of course, you've got to balance the potential, your payment terms to the issuer. You've got to balance that also with potential rebates you might get back. So it's not just a simple equation.
Right.
Okay, one more question, because I'm conscious we're out of time, but I quite like this one. It's related to the fraud question. What about the fear of uncontrolled spend?
I still think that all goes back to how you manage the program. I mean, it's not an implement and forget it. I mean, you do need to establish some different activities like monthly reporting. If someone is looking at, who are the top suppliers with whom you are using the cards, or you start to identify where are these one-offs, these random things, through reporting tools, just even through simple, like a Microsoft Excel product, if you have to go down to that, that level. I mean, there are ways on managing, reviewing the spend, but it's training, it's developing the right policies. It's the consequences if people are not using the cards appropriately. It's all about that whole environment you're setting up.
Yeah, and I think that whole thing about transparency, I think people often forget about the fact that Pcards are much more transparent than your other mechanisms. And that in itself tends to reinforce control, because there's nowhere to hide. But I appreciate your thoughts on that. I am conscious that we're 3 minutes over time. I'd really like to thank you, Lynn, for sharing your experience. I do encourage everyone, get in touch with Lynn. There's that email address. I'll replay it in the follow-up to this note, where we'll send out the recording. But there's some great value here, and Lynn brings a lot of experience from both sides of the house. So thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you all for your time. Hope you found it useful, thought-provoking, and we'll see you again very, very soon. Thank you.